Welcome back to the show, I'm your host Kenneth. So not too long ago, the new Battlefield game came out. For those of you who don't follow the gaming community, Battlefield is a series of first-person shooter games developed by the studio DICE, a Swedish game developer. The games are known for featuring massive maps and a combination of infantry, vehicle, and aerial combat. The latest version of the game, known as Battlefield 1, is set in World War I. So what does all this have to do with cinema or filmmaking? Well, the game features a variety of single-player campaigns. Each of those campaigns is a brief look at different important moments throughout the war. For example, there's a campaign showing the British storming of Gallipoli in modern-day Turkey. Another campaign features the German airship attacks on London. Another on a British tank crew on the Western Front. Playing through those campaigns got me to thinking about different aspects of filmmaking. The most interesting campaign to me, called Nothing Is Written, is set in Saudi Arabia and features the famous Lawrence of Arabia, and focuses on trapping and destroying an enemy armored train. Playing that campaign made me want to revisit the film that is widely regarded as one of the best films of all time, Lawrence of Arabia. The film, released in 1962, directed by David Leone and starring Peter O'Toole, follows T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was a British officer assigned to Arabia who worked alongside the local Bedouin people to fight the Ottoman Empire through guerrilla warfare, eventually pushing out the Ottomans and working to form a new Arab National Council to rule Saudi Arabia. The film was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 7, including the Oscars for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Score, Best Art Direction, Best Film Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Cinematography. The film also had the first nomination for a Middle Eastern actor. However, the cinematography of that film is what I want to focus on today. The cinematographer for the film was Freddie Young, who won 3 consecutive cinematography Oscars starting with Lawrence of Arabia, his next 2 being for Dr. Zhivago and Ryan's Daughter. He is widely considered one of the most influential cinematographers of all time. However, when I went back to watch Lawrence of Arabia, it was a little unusual to think that the style of cinematography in the film is considered one of the best and most influential, since it's so dissimilar from modern cinematography. So, what are the trends that are popular in modern cinematography? Well, films these days seem to be focused on 2 trends, very personal and very dynamic shots. You can see the personality that is popular in most dialogue scenes. The camera will get very close to the subject, sometimes uncomfortably so. Films also frequently use shallow depth of field, meaning the background of a shot is blurred out. You can see the dynamism that is popular in very long tracking scenes, like in the opening to the James Bond film Spectre.
Where are you going?
I won't be long.
This is in contrast to Lawrence of Arabia, which featured a lot of wide open shots, not very close to the subjects and not with much going on in the shots dynamically. Why is Lawrence of Arabia so much different from many modern films? Well, partly due to technical limitations. Lawrence of Arabia was shot on the Super Panavision 70 format, which uses very large cameras. Those cameras require huge tripods and dolly systems to support, so it's very difficult to get moving shots or shots that are very close to the subject. That isn't a total explanation though, since the opening to the film, with a reporter attempting to interview a variety of people, does seem more similar to modern cinematography.
Lord Allenby, could you give me a few words about Colonel Lawrence?
What, more words? The revolt in the desert played a decisive part in the Middle Eastern campaign.
Yes, sir, but about Colonel Lawrence himself.
No, I didn't know him well.
The film also wasn't using any technology like Cinerama that prevented close-ups. Well, the true answer to why the film uses that certain style of cinematography is that it fit the mood and emotion of the film, which all cinematography should attempt to do. The wide and static shots in the film show the smallness and futility of man, even making the desert into a character of its own in the film. It also serves to show the beauty that the desert can have. This makes sense because the desert is a main part of the film, even more important than the Ottomans. On one hand, the desert swallows people and kills them of heat exhaustion and dehydration. For example, one of Lawrence's porters is swallowed by quicksand. On the other hand, the landscape serves as shelter for Lawrence's band. For example, when the group of Bedouin guerrillas cross a supposedly impassable desert to sneak and attack an important Ottoman port. It would be difficult to properly grasp the scale of the desert and its importance to the story without showing that through cinematography. The use of color is another aspect of cinematography where Lawrence of Arabia differs from modern films. Most modern films are very stylized. They use a very desaturated and contrasty look, often being tinted teal and orange. Lawrence of Arabia, on the other hand, is quite colorful and has a very accurate and realistic color scheme. So then, are modern films wrong to use the currently popular style of cinematography? Some are, naturally, but a cinematographer's focus should never be on meeting popular trends. Everything about a film should work together to convey the story and emotion of the film. As it's referred to in French, mise en scène, placing on a stage. Everything must be properly placed in the production of a film to tell a story. Now it's time for a quick break. When we come back, it's time to talk about storytelling, more specifically why short films are so different from feature-length films. Welcome back to the show. Once again, I'm your host, Kenneth, and I want to go back and talk about Battlefield 1 some more. So again, we started out the show, obviously, talking about Battlefield 1, and then transitioned into Lawrence of Arabia, but now I just want to stick on the topic of Battlefield 1 for a few minutes. So, in Battlefield 1, as I mentioned at the start of the show, there are a variety of war stories, 6 in fact. Each of those war stories takes you through different events that happened in World War I. All of them are fictional, but based on true stories. And it's a nice way to kind of get a different taste of different things throughout the war. Now, in each of those war stories, you get effectively what is a short film. They're all very short. It's about 40 minutes to an hour of gameplay. It varies. The first one is longer. It's about an hour and a half. There's one that's only about 20 minutes. But they vary, but again, mostly 40 minutes to an hour. Now, I did say, just a second ago, that they were effectively short films. But now I'm saying they're 40 minutes to an hour long. You might be wondering, well, 40 minutes is the minimum for something to be referred to as a feature length generally. And yes, you would be correct. However, these are video games, and times don't work the same in video games compared to films. So even though you may be playing for 40 minutes, there's not actually 40 minutes worth of storytelling going on. It cuts back and forth between cutscenes and you actually playing the action. Now, with the action, obviously there's action in films too, but in films there's generally information being conveyed during the action, and that's true to some extent during video games, but you know, some of the action scenes, some of the fighting scenes may go on for a very long time, and it's not really practical to spread out dialogue through that entire situation when you're making a video game. So in general, about half to a third of the length of a video game is about equivalent to a film in terms of storytelling. So many AAA titles that are well known for their campaigns, RPGs like Skyrim or Witcher or other video games like that, their campaigns will stretch on sometimes even 30 or 40 hours. And in that 30 or 40 hours, you only get about what a feature-length film would be. Sometimes more because of side quests and stuff, but the main quest is generally about a feature length. So, what does all this have to do with storytelling, which I mentioned I would talk about? Well, the answer is that the Battlefield 1 campaigns made a very amateur mistake in their storytelling, and it was kind of frustrating to watch it. I know a lot of people really enjoyed the Battlefield 1 campaign, and don't get me wrong, there was some pretty awesome moments in it. But as a whole, all of the campaigns felt very flat. There was just something missing. And so I felt the need, naturally, as a filmmaker and a storyteller, to dive in and figure out what it was about each of those campaigns that was missing, that fell flat. So for this, I want to focus on a campaign called The Runner. Now, The Runner is about Gallipoli. If you've seen the film Gallipoli, it's fairly similar in terms of what the basic premise of the story is. It's about an older Australian, I guess he's a captain, I'm not sure his exact rank, but some kind of higher ranking officer. And he's basically come in and taken a job for a younger 16 or 17-year-old individual who basically lied about their age to get into the war. And because the runner is such a dangerous job, this older officer didn't want this younger person to be doing that dangerous job, so he volunteered to do it instead. So you're playing as this older commanding officer, working as a runner. Now, a runner in the war, this is before we had radios and stuff like that back in World War I. So communication was very difficult. So essentially his job was to run through enemy lines and sneak around the enemy to get to the different positions in the war, the different British positions, to convey information. So, a quick breakdown of the story. Now, for those of you who are interested in playing this game and don't want any spoilers, this will include spoilers. So the game starts out, you're storming the beach of Gallipoli, and then once you get to the top, that's where the game really starts. That's where initially that young individual, 16 or 17 years old, is assigned to be a runner, but the older officer does not want him to be a runner, so he volunteers instead. So then you're running back and forth. Now, the storming of Gallipoli did not go very well for British. It was a very long, very hard-fought battle and war, but eventually the Turkish and the Ottomans did hold Gallipoli. So on that first day, the British decided to pull a retreat. Now, to cover their retreat, they decided to use their dreadnought battleships to shell the Ottoman position in order to cover their retreat. Now, the young person who we were talking about earlier was up at the very, very front lines, attempting to storm a fort when that order came back. And so, as a runner, you had to run up to the forward position to tell everyone that they have to get out, and because the whole area is going to be shelled. But when you get up there, you find out that pretty much all of the soldiers, particularly the young ones, decided to go forward and take the fort. So you get up to the fort, and there's several people up there, many of them injured, and basically you decide to sacrifice yourself. You tell them to get out of there, go back, retreat, get back to the ship, and you'll cover their retreat. And at the end of that situation, you basically die because you get shelled. Now, that ending moment was very beautiful, and it includes some very beautiful music. If you're into the music of games or TV at all, I would recommend listening to the Battlefield 1 soundtrack. The specific track is Dawn of a New Era, just in case you're interested. But anyway, that plays. It's a super emotional moment, but it just feels a little flat. And the real reason is because emotion is important when it comes to film. You don't want to bore your audience at all. And as humans, we're very emotional creatures. We love connections to other people. Emotion is so important in film that even many filmmakers, such as the famous film editor Walter Murch, will say that the emotion is even more important than the story. Many Hollywood films will be filled with plot holes, as many different sources will tell you. However, you generally don't notice those plot holes as long as there's good emotion in the film. And so, emotion is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to make someone feel connected to a fictional character on a screen. And the way you have to do that is by making the audience, or you if you're playing the game, you want to feel like you can relate to that character on the screen. So this is done in many different ways, and in video games you can kind of cheat a little bit, because if you're playing as a character, you're going to feel kind of connected to them because you're pretending to be them. But obviously in film you don't always have that liberty. So many films have different ways. Disney, kind of stereotypically, is known for, killing the parents of a character. Say in some more recent films, Frozen, the parents of Anna and Elsa died. Or in Tangled, we had an individual who was kidnapped from their parents. But there's different ways, but the importance is that you have to take the time to make your audience feel a connection to a character. You can't just throw a character on the screen and automatically assume that your audience is going to like them. You have to learn about them. There may be, like in Lord of the Rings, we have kind of a despicable character in Boromir, who at the end sacrifices himself, and it's an emotional moment because you learned more about Boromir. You knew who he was. You knew that he was kind of a self-seeking, not totally in the best interest of everyone character, but at the end he sacrifices himself, and that sacrifice is such an emotional moment because you realize that for the character, that's such a change in who they are, that Boromir had to come to that realization that he wouldn't make it out of there, that his best option was to help the people that originally he just kind of passed off and said, oh, they're just hobbits. So that was an emotional moment because you felt that connection and you saw kind of that clock ticking in Boromir's head and his realization that he needed to sacrifice himself. That kind of creating a character, creating a conflicted character even, and creating a character who goes through different phases is so important. Now, that's all how you do it in feature films, and short films are very different because short films are generally 8 to 10 minutes max. And you don't have time to create fully developed characters. Often short films will rely on different visual exposition rather than actually building out characters through dialogue. That's a lot of times why you'll see short films not have very much dialogue. They're often more dependent on the actors, their acting, and different things that appear in the scene to convey information. Because, again, there's not time to convey all of that with dialogue. So in short films, you have to do things differently, and if you try to treat a short film like a feature film, it's going to end very badly for a variety of reasons. And when it came down to it, that's the issue I had with these Battlefield 1 campaigns, is that they decided to treat these effectively short films as features and try to get all of the character development, all of the plot development that you would see in a feature into a short film, and quite frankly, it really doesn't work. Going back to the campaign, The Runner, that I was talking about, the reason why it fell so flat is because when your main character died at the end, yes, it was emotional, but you didn't really have a connection to that character. You didn't have time to see them, have that emotional shift or change at all. It wasn't like Boromir, where it was kind of a changing from a selfish, self-centered individual to that sacrifice. This was a person who had already sacrificed themselves several times, essentially. It was just you didn't have time to learn enough about the character to have that connection to them, but it tried to pass it off as like a major emotional moment. And I think if the campaign had taken the time, or I guess taken the visual space more like to convey more information about the character, perhaps, maybe a letter from his wife that he read at some point, or from his kids, just something that would make you feel connected to that character, because it's hard to relate to somebody off fighting in a war that happened 100 years ago. You have to give them some kind of emotional connection, and that type of emotional connection comes when we can relate to a character. So that could come from a variety of ways, but quite frankly just didn't really happen. Another campaign which I think probably had the worst story out of all the Battlefield 1 campaigns, but had the most potential, was the campaign that I talked about at the beginning of this podcast or this show. and that was the campaign with Lawrence of Arabia, Nothing is Written. You're not actually playing as Lawrence of Arabia, unfortunately. You're playing as a female Bedouin warrior, and so you're basically going around and setting up the ambush for the armored train, and then at the end taking out the armored train. And again, the film kind of tries to have that feature-length storytelling, but there's not really any connection to the character because there's no time. You literally learn nothing about the main character other than that it's a female and they're a Bedouin. So there's no connection, there's no reason to feel a connection to the character and feel concerned about what's going to happen to them. And really outside of that, there's no interesting characters. Lawrence of Arabia only shows up for like 1 or 2 minutes in the entire, 30-minute campaign. So there's just not really any character to feel a connection to. And so it's that sort of thing that storytelling is very hard, and don't let anyone tell you that storytelling is easy. It's a hard thing to do. You have to be very good at it. You have to be very good at learning how to lay out the plot and the emotion and your characters. It's very difficult, and it takes a lot of practice. However, this video game, Battlefield 1, coming from a major developer who has plenty of money and could have put plenty of resources into hiring someone who could properly tell a story like the Battlefield developers wanted to tell. They didn't, and it's a little disappointing, but partly understandable because Battlefield 1 is primarily an online multiplayer game. The campaigns have always been kind of a sideshow, but it's just one of those things that you kind of look at and are disappointed by, but it is an opportunity to learn more about storytelling as we just did here. So anyway, that's it for this show. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, feel free to tune back in again. And this is Cinesense signing off.